Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special interview with two lovely gentlemen that we've got here. We've got Dave and Dan from two very different spaces in the aviation world, the virtual reality world, or virtual aviation world. And we will find out a little bit more about them. Yeah, thanks for joining us. Dave, we'll start with you. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate your time. So what is it that you do, Dave?
Well, that's a really good question. The short answer is we inspire students, young kids, to learn more about things happening in the real world that are connected to the things they're learning in the classroom. So our focus is on STEM, science, technology, education, and math. We do infuse the arts from time to time, which makes it STEAM. But connecting, like we're doing here, learning that happens in the class with people like you out in the real world.
Nice. And obviously there is a link to the virtual flight simulation world here. We will talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but let's flip over to Dan then. Hi, Dan. How are you?
Doing pretty good yourself.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Dan, who are you for anyone that might not know your face or might not know Flight Code X?
Yeah, I'm Dan. I'm the creator and brainchild behind Flight Codex here, which is a no-code scenario builder to be able to add into X-Plane automation and situation scenarios controls as easy as drawing flowcharts. It's a way to automate what the instructor can do and get the students up to speed a lot quicker while all still remaining in the sim, create content and everything like that. And what we did with the Pulitzer is been able to enable the race course to be run virtually and have automated scoring.
And so you did mention the Pulitzer Trophy there. I think that's definitely something for, it's a seamless segue into, hopefully, Dave, you can tell us a little bit more about the Pulitzer Trophy and what interests you about that and why you brought it to flight simulation.
It's a really good question. So I would imagine, like some of the folks that are watching this and listening to this, that reference is probably new. And I'll admit, I didn't know what the Pulitzer Trophy was until I got involved 3-4 months ago. And essentially it was a race that was run 100 years ago. And actually, to put it in perspective, 2 years before Lindbergh flew from this part of the world to across the Atlantic to your part of the world. And so the idea was to promote aircraft and how cool these things were and what benefits they brought. So fast forward 100 years, the race is being recreated as an all-electric aircraft race. And there's actually two different electric aircraft. There's the Beta, Alea, and the I think it's the Pipistrel that are flying in this race now. Function-wise, they're different aircraft, but they're still electric, and they'll fly this course in Springfield, Ohio. We were brought in to help on the education front, and we took it on from a virtual perspective. So we are developing what we're calling a STEMINAR, which will be for basically middle school, high school students, the first day, which is the 10th of October. And we've got experts from around the world, actually, that are going to be talking to high school and middle school students and answering their questions about what's happening in the advanced air mobility space. So drones, electric aircraft, things like that, hybrid aircraft. And in addition to that, when we started diving into what we could do, we reached out to the folks at X-Plane, and they were very gracious and responded very quickly and said, "Sure, we'll jump in, we'll support that." And so they gave us some fully licensed X-Plane applications to hand out so that students who didn't have access could use them. And they also suggested someone that could develop the race itself in the virtual world, sim world. And that's how we got in touch with Dan. And Dan also very quickly and very graciously responded and said, "Yeah, I'm all in on that." So we gave him the characteristics of the actual race itself. Truth be told, when we first gave them to him, they were one thing, and then they got adjusted a little bit, but he turned around and made the adjustments. and he built it using his coding system, and it's wicked cool. I'll admit I'm a guy. I'm coming into the sim world on this, but for someone like me to look at this and go, "Wow, this is really slick." And the people, we have weekly calls that talk about what do we do for this event coming up, and I've shown them this, and they're kind of blown away because it gives anybody a chance to fly this course. And Dan can do a much better job of explaining how that works and what some of the elements are in there. But really, the only difference is going to be if you're flying the actual course in Springfield this coming weekend, or depending on when this goes out, that October 12th, you know, you won't see the balloons in the air that are the starting point for the race in the sim. But other than that, it will look very similar.
And obviously, there is a huge link between flight simulation and STEM. There is a direct link between the number of, there's so many people that started their real world flying career in flight simulation. I know there's a couple of people on my team at FSElite. There's people all over the world that have seen a keen interest in flying through their home flight simulator. What is it about this event that you really hope to sort of pass on in the view of STEM education to children?
It's another really good question. I think, one of the things that I've been pleasantly surprised by is the number of people that have gotten involved. And to be fair, we really haven't promoted this much at all. So we've had really a decent amount of organic uptake, and the types of groups that have gotten involved. It's coming from high schools across the United States. We may even have a school through some connections in New Zealand and India. And then the other is there's different groups. There's flying groups like in the States, the Civil Air Patrol. They started signing up for this as well. They're cadets. So the connection there is they're learning to fly. But I think the other thing that we're showing is the types of aircraft. So in this case, it's all electric aircraft, which some people may not be familiar with. And I think that's the other piece here is that we've created some exposure for things that people are learning about. But the last piece, and this is something I learned as part of this process, and it's very relevant right now, is the aircraft that's flying in the actual race was designed using X-plane. And in fact, big news this week, which I'm sure you're all aware of, that company, Beta, not only got a bunch of money from another large aircraft company a couple of weeks ago, but also announced that they were filing for initial public offering or money on Wall Street. And the beginning of that aircraft started with a sim. And I think that's a really, really powerful point that we can make through this. It's not just being able to fly, but also being able to design and build.
I'm thinking about, what it takes to get an electric aircraft off the ground, or just know the fundamentals of how a sim works. I think a lot of sim pilots tend to spend a lot of time tinkering rather than actually flying. So Dan, that kind of brings me over to you really. Flight Codex is, like you say, you're able to build scenarios, all sorts of things that sort of sit within the sim just for, creating a flow chart. What is it that you think, those people using Flight Codex or getting into, that tinkering world, what is it about your software that might encourage kids or young adults to go into sort of some of the STEM research areas?
Yeah, there's been a whole lot of things with the way Flight Codex works. How we were able to bring the rules from the Pulitzer race almost directly in. It has some very similar game mechanics that you would see in other engines. And flight simulators have been notoriously just big open worlds. that don't have a whole lot to really do except for hop in an airplane and fly from point A to point B. So Flight Codex has been able to kind of bring it down to a point where you can create challenges, you can create games, you can create educational content that sits in there. And I think, a lot of students, as they progress from, the entertainment side of it in content creation, has been able to also see some light with academic research as well. We've been working with a local school here to be able to pull in a lot of their real flight data and run it through our system to be able to pull out information that you wouldn't be able to easily pull out before. Identify all the students who have, oversped or, had too hard of a landing. So you can see that real world data coming back into the sim that you can go back and create more educational, better tailored scenarios for the student. So there's a whole gamut of things that are possible now that you can have this control over a simulator that wasn't there before.
Yeah. And there's I've used Flight Codex myself, and I certainly don't see myself as a coder, someone that is able to even manipulate certain variables. Tell me a little bit about the platform itself and what makes it so easy to use versus having to flick zeros and ones to zeros.
The biggest thought was to simplify the how you interact with X-Plane specifically. It's a lot of code and a lot of those variables that you have to deal with. So I kind of tried to bring it down to a box of Legos. Where everything's kind of a module. You pick up, I want to play a sound. It's a box you place down, and I play the sound, and then after I play that sound, I do something else, and I draw a line to that next thing. So there's still some of the kind of coding logic that you have to have, but you don't have to know the individual, what's under the hood of how that coding logic happens. You just need to know, if this, then that, and it goes from point A to point B, and just follows the chain down. You got to know, I want to create a trigger based on the aircraft location. So you take a geo coordinate of where you want to be, and it automatically maps the position of the airplane to that point, and will cause your trigger to happen when the thing moving on to the next portion of the visual script.
And so actually it makes that tinkering with a sim really accessible to those that are just might be starting, or someone like me that has been a flight simmer for over half of my life that just doesn't have the kind of feasibility in my mind to delve into some of that bits of code and stuff. So Flight Codex in itself is a STEM educational tool, right? You're helping other people get into coding and essentially building something from nothing.
Yeah, no, it's very true. It's just been an incredible thing to be able to put together, and the thought is how do I simplify all the hard stuff to make it easy for somebody to just come in and snap stuff together.
I was just going to touch on that too, because you said it very succinctly. It is a STEM education tool, and one of the things we're looking at doing, Dan and I have talked about this and had a chance to talk about it last weekend. How do we take it to the next level from an educational standpoint? And we've had conversations with a few of the schools that are involved in the Pulitzer Trophy race. But what we're talking about is for the next event, and we are talking about some others. I can't go into them quite yet, but we'll actually have students develop the scenarios. So here's what we're trying to accomplish, and then we not only do we hand in this, like we did in this case, we handed them the finished product, but we'll actually get the students developing what it is we need, and then they'll be using it for whatever that particular event is.
And you mentioned kind of the next event. Where do you see this kind of competition between within the classroom or within the wider sort of either flight simulation space or entry to STEM education? Where do you see this going? Where would you like to see it in a few years' time?
So another really good question. I think that the answer to that is really what we're doing here is representative. What you're doing is representative of what we're trying to do as well an educational standpoint, and that is the things we're learning about and the things that your audience is learning about from this interview. Those are the things we want to do um, for education. So if a student in city X was lucky enough to be able to talk to you or a pilot or a designer or an engineer or whatever it happens to be, an artist, typically those would stay in that classroom or on that school site. And what we think is that there's an opportunity for learning that happens in point A to be shared in point B, C, D through Z. So that's one thing we want to accomplish. The other is two other things, really. The other is there is competition, and certainly there is in the Pulitzer Trophy race, but we also think there's an opportunity for collaboration. If you, I mean, take for example, there may be some schools somewhere, and we see this here, where there may not be enough students to have a particular course, right? Or the money isn't there to do it. But if you roll up those students and you have an expert engage with those students anywhere, now you can deliver learning in a way that really there's aspects of it that are done, but we think there's an opportunity to do even more. And the way you make that even more work, and this comes from my background. We're trying to deliver content and education that we don't charge for. There's a lot of educational companies that will, yeah, they'll do that for you, but there's a fee. And we believe that, frankly, the stories that are out there, once you start understanding what they are, there's a lot of people, companies that are talking to one another, right? Dan and I were at a conference last week, and they're there for a reason. They're selling their story, basically. And we believe there's an opportunity to sell that story um, from an inspirational standpoint and an educational standpoint into schools. And I don't mean that sell it from a dollar standpoint. I mean help kids understand what it is you're doing as a company. If you're designing a new aircraft, if you're building a new electric car, if you're whatever it is you're doing, you have a story to tell. And we help those companies tell their story to a different audience. And that audience can go home and share it with family and friends. And I used an example this morning. Drones are a good example. We're seeing drones in a lot of places. They've been in Africa for a long time, and they're coming back to other areas. But sometimes there's a problem because the people that are actually out there don't want the drones flying overhead. Interestingly enough, the kids do. So where do you start telling that story? If you were trying to get that story out there, where would you start? Would you start with the most resistant audience? Probably may not want to. Let's start with the audience that's most inclined, and that's part of what we do. So in a nutshell, we call it educational public relations. We take the stories that are out there and we help shape them and share them to a younger audience by bringing that younger audience in to tell part of the story. So that's ultimately where we'd like it to go.
And then for the events that are happening this week, how many people are involved in that? How many schools are they just in the US, or are they sort of international as well?
So right now, this all came together very quickly. I mean, I think the idea of the STEMINAR that's the other amazing thing about what Dan has done. What, Dan, you and I have been 2 months ago at the most, maybe even a month ago.
Yeah.
We started working on the sim component. So it's come together very quickly. And because of that, we've been cautious about how we promote it. So we don't have some big numbers, but we do have schools. I will say we have schools from coast to coast in the United States. And I think, although I've got to hear back, I sent them an email yesterday, and we're in very different time zones. But I think we're going to have a school in New Zealand and maybe a few other places. And depending on what comes out of this conversation today, I think part of the plan is to open it up and make the race add-in accessible to others. So we, in theory, could end up with people all around the world flying the Pulitzer race.
And obviously, there's, you say this has come around quite quickly, and it would, I imagine, would be quite hard to fly anything, particularly around a racetrack in the sky, without any hardware or sort of, direct input. It's quite hard to do with the up and down arrows, I imagine. Um, is there a sort of hardware that's been recommended for these schools? Obviously, there's certain hardware that is a bit more sensitive to others. Might be a bit of an unfair advantage for those that have forked out for some of the nicer stuff. But have you issued guides to the schools to make sure it's as fair as possible?
It's a so there's some challenges to doing that, of course, because different schools have access to different resources, and what we've tried to do is, to your point, make it as fair as possible by giving the software out. We haven't recommended anything. We've had schools ask. It gets a little challenging when you start delivering hardware, because you've got to get it there. You've got to have someone there to make sure it's all working, and so it gets incrementally complicated. I think the way we've attempted to get it to as level a playing field as possible is to put the software out there and enable kids and students to take it home and install it at home. And yet, because they may have an advantage, but whatever happens has to come in from the system that's at the school. So more than likely, that's probably where the best equipment may be in place. There may only be one, though, but the students at home can practice at home and then come and submit the one that comes from the one at school. And that's our best case solution today for trying to create a level playing field. The hardware makes it. You're absolutely right. It is. Though I will say one other thing, and this was Dan's suggestion. What happens with this particular race is it starts in flight at cruising speed, so it does eliminate the takeoff and landing, but you still have to be able to make turns for sure.
Yeah,
and that's the nice thing about X-Plane is even with the mouse, it's still flyable. Even if you don't have a nice joystick or rudder setup. And the race is in essentially the virtual physical space, so whatever you do there is still constrained by what's in the sim. So even if you're flying with a mouse, or you decide to turn on the autopilot and do just the pure navigation part of it, it's still it's a simple enough race course, but it's still challenging in the way that it's with electric vehicles. A Cessna can do this course with its eyes closed, but an electric vehicle is going to have a whole set of different challenges, aside for just the airmanship to get around the corners.
and I guess what would be really great is for your next event, maybe some developers of hardware might watch this video and visit the sites that we put below. Maybe. So my next question is, we've spoke about what you'd like people involved in this process to take away. What is it individually that you'd like to take away from this first event? We'll go with Dan first.
Aside for seeing more people use flight codecs, really want to see how it holds up in something of this scale. There's a decent amount of people going to be using my system, and it's really the first test of being able to put together a whole race course that's put out to a bunch of people, and then just kind of seeing what eyes light up, seeing what sparks of interest come out there. I know Dave talked a little bit about the STEM side of things, but there's a lot of history that's missed with STEM. There's no H in STEAM or STEM, and a lot of first principle things come from history, and being able to recreate that and re-explore it can be a great thing. After this, can we relive all the old Pulitzer Trophy races? Can we any other cool flights out there or historical events that have happened that can be recreated that students can really latch on to further their education and further their advancement into whatever field they choose.
The Pulitzer Trophy being probably the most prime example of that, right? 1920 to now, we're now using electric vehicles in the real world to compete with it. It's crazy, isn't it? You'd just imagine telling someone from the 1800s what aviation is like, because it just didn't exist before, right? It just blow the
Yeah.
mind. Nice. And what about you, Dave? What do you hope to take away?
Well, I've heard Dan say this recently as well. There's no H in STEM, and it's a profound statement, because I do think that what we're doing here, and the Pulitzer Trophy is a good example. There is a way to insert H into STEM, and we're doing it because it is a historical race. But I do think there's some things using sims that where we can actually bring. We talked about collaboration, depending on how this is edited, a little earlier or a little later, but there are some things we can do where we can add the H in the STEM with sim. And to Dan's point, we can bring some history into this. And there are some historical events from an aviation perspective that are coming up over the next year or two. And the opportunity to engage young learners in those events and have them be inspired by learning almost hands-on what happened or didn't happen, I think is a pretty powerful thing to be able to do. So, we've got, there's a lot of history around aviation, of course, but there's some biggies that are coming up. And I think as we start to bring in schools from around the world and have them have hands-on in developing the tools that they can use to learn, but that can be shared with others. That's, you asked what I want to take away. I'd like to see that happen, and that's a big part of my mission. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see.
Finally, how can the rest of the wider community get involved and support either the STEM activities that you've got going on this week, and hopefully more and more in the future? And then, how can people get involved with Flight Code X?
The STEM events that are happening this week, if you happen to be anywhere near Springfield, the Springfield Buckley Airport, I encourage you to go out and actually do hands-on, looking at some of the aircraft there, watching the races. I think it'll be pretty cool. As far as the virtual portion of it, we have a STEMINAR coming up that will be live on Friday, but after that, we'll have components of that anybody can tune into. That's the whole idea. And then as far as the race itself, most likely there'll be a link somewhere in this where you'll be able to go and download a copy of the actual add-in, the Pulitzer Trophy that you can put into X-Plane. And if you are an instructor anywhere in the world that has a group of students who are interested, I encourage you to do that, because I think it'll be a lot of fun. Just keep an eye on where it goes from here. We want to do more things like this, and we've been very lucky to work with the folks at X-Plane and with Dan and Flight Codex to make these things happen.
Dan, how do people get involved with Flight Codex, a program that actually has allowed me to create something in X-Plane rather than just using someone else's? How can everyone else experience that?
Just go to our website, flightcodex.com. We have a demo available if you have, X-Plane, or even if you don't have X-Plane, our demo works with X-Plane's demo. Try out what we have. We have, tic-tac-toe in the sky. Right now with the installer, you can also, gain access to the course. If you have a full copy of it, you'll be able to run the course as well through there. But kind of explore and see what we got. You can find me usually sitting around on the X-Plane Discord, email out, but yeah, kind of have some ideas and see what kind of content can be created. It's all just like Legos. You can't imagine what you're going to do with something until you just start sitting down playing with it. So yeah, go tinker.
We will, of course, leave all the links relevant to both Dave and Dan below. But for now, I'd like to thank you, Dave, and you, Dan, for joining me for this FSElite interview around the virtual Pulitzer Trophy. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.